That is good match management by Hikaru Nakamura. Remember, we see the eval bar go up and down. The players have no idea, and that looked like an equal position. The same amount of material for both sides. So now we're in game 7. It's 4-2 Hikaru. Are we going to see a King's Indian from Magnus?
We might, and we saw King's Indian earlier from Hikaru. Magnus saying, give me some of that. And will Hikaru play Bishop D3? Oh my gosh, he does! We have the same position with colors reversed. A little match strategy, a little verve from Hikaru Nakamura, and smiles by only one player. Magnus is not amused.
And just like the recent movie, that smile is not pleasant. That is going to haunt Magnus Carlsen because Bishop D3 induces Bishop G4, looks very logical, and then the Bishop would have gone back to E2. So he says, anything you can do, I can do better. And he just says, let's go, Magnus. You're going to have to come up with something new.
And another perk of putting the Bishop on D3 is that it can slide back to C2. And later on, once the knight appears on C5, as it frequently does in the King's Indian, the pressure on E4 often forces White to contort himself. With the Bishop nicely sitting on C2, White can just keep going about his business. In this move H3, we saw Carlsen play G4. Hikaru says 2 can play at that game.
They certainly can. And for Magnus, he has to figure out which strike he wants, E5 or C5. He chooses neither. He plays A5. He wants to gain space on the queen side and not allow a bayonet-style attack with pawn to B4. So I think that Magnus is kind of playing this like dodgy chess. He's just sort of avoiding the tension. He's just making Hikaru figure out things. But the issue for Magnus is usually that works. Except in this match, Hikaru has figured everything out pretty much to perfection.
He most certainly has, and I think this opening choice by Magnus, it signifies that he is ready to take on more risk. He wants to wipe this 2-point lead out going into the 3+1 portion. He knows how confident Hikaru is in that notorious Title Tuesday time control, and Magnus doesn't want to let this lead persist because every game you play when you're down by 2, you might go down by 3, and Hikaru is not known to give away big leads in the SAC, even against someone of Carlsen's caliber.
No, and you and I both majored in history in college, and well, history for Magnus does not want to repeat itself because the only time he has lost the 5+1 time control was against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in 2020 semifinals, and guess what? He lost that match. So he lost the segment 4.5, 3.5, and that's the only time that has happened. It's the only time he's lost in the SEC. So Magnus, he needs to get things right. He needs to just play solidly, not take unnecessary risk, but also kind of make things a bit spicy.
And that's exactly what he's doing. We have, in some ways, a similar position from their first King's Indian affair. Once again, the colors were reversed in that game. No, you're not seeing things. Hikaru was indeed on the black side. Now he's on the white side. And he's taking a different approach on the king side. Robert, the reason you don't want to go G4 here is because the knight is going to jump into F4. Never go knight back to F6 in these positions. That's a King's Indian crime. You don't mind sacrificing a pawn to open up that dark squared bishop.
Right. I mean, let's go for an attack. And, well, Magnus says, don't mind if I do. A4. The problem is A3, one pawn can attack all of the enemy forces. If you play A3, White pushes the B pawn, keeps the file closed. So I'm looking at this. I feel like Magnus, sure, he wants B5. Easier said than done. Right, Danya? Because I can take, then bring a queen to E2, try to protect that pawn at all costs.
Yeah, and you also have to watch out for a well-timed bishop takes C5. Normally, White doesn't want to give away the dark squared bishop, but when the circumstances are right, Black's position, it's really flimsy, it's cramped, and we're also not talking about the king side. At some point, White could get the wheels turning on the other side of the board with, a well-timed G4. You could try even knight C3 to E2 and G4. On the other hand, you got to be very careful about not allowing B5 because Black's attack comes really fast once the B file gets opened.
What do you make of Magnus's decision to play a King's Indian against the world leader in the King's Indian? I feel like it's a little bit almost desperate.
I was attracted briefly to knight G5 check, but Hikaru doesn't take the adventurous route. I agree that it smacks a little bit of desperation, and I don't appreciate that you're calling the King's Indian a desperate opener. No, just kidding. I agree completely.
Yeah, I just feel like Hikaru's so good at the King's Indian when he is the black pieces. So, he knows how to parry off the immediate threats. And you're pointing out knight h4 to f5. The reason why that's a viable option is the knight on h5 is loose. Hikaru plays it. But something about the move is not favored by the engine. And I wonder what it is, Danya. Like, how does black proceed here? C6 is a typical plan. It doesn't look so ideal right now. So what can Magnus do?
So I did cheat a little bit. Apparently the best move is knight h5 back to f6. Now it's a logical move because it parries knight f5. But the reason knight h4 is a little bit awkward, I think, is because it's just hard to get things going after the knight moves back to f6. It's kind of a one-move threat, and if black parries it, black's not playing for f5 in this position, but Magnus does not parry it. He allows knight f5, and I don't like that one bit. Even though the bishop is bad from an attacking perspective, Robert, it's integral from a defensive perspective, and I really think Hikaru can get things going on the king side once he eliminates this bishop.
And I think Magnus is trying to use your plan. He'll play queen, I think, e8, and then try to go b5 as quickly as possible, right? The queen, the bishop, the rook on b8 all stare at the b5 square. So I believe that's what Magnus is aiming for, but he keeps pausing. He's down 2 minutes on the clock. There's a knife on f5. It's daggers, and he goes queen e8, but I feel like he's just a little bit slow right now.
And Hikaru is definitely not so. He can now play the move f2, f4, assuming black takes with the knight. And why can he play that move? Because there's no longer a bishop on g7. So that bishop, it had a lot of potential energy. It was preventing white from striking on the king side. Now I think Hikaru's got to step on it and play f4.
Throw those pawns forward, go for an attack. Black is very much trying to do the same with b7 to b5. Like, that's Magnus's big idea. But as you point out, bishop e3 takes knight on c5, will shatter black's pawn structure. So b5 doesn't just get you an attack, doesn't win the game. It gets you a really bad pawn structure, and you better hope your attack is in time.
And there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your speed belts. This is a good old school attack on opposite sides. Clearly, Hikaru much, much better. The engine isn't a fan of what Magnus is doing. But at this point, Magnus has no choice. He literally has one idea in this entire position. It's to open the B file, pile up on the B2 pawn, maybe look for some knight B3 tactics. But largely, he's playing hope chess.
Yes, yeah, it's wishful thinking that he is going to get an attack, but look at the clocks. Hikaru had a 2-minute lead. It's now dropped to 1. That's still a hefty margin for him. He's well ahead in the clock, but I just feel like Magnus, he could scare people, and Hikaru's only human. He may play like an engine. He's still a human being, and look at this. He strikes in the center, takes on c5, goes d6, and the eval bar doesn't love it, but I think from a practical point of view, it gets white activity, and that's exactly what you want. Whoa.
And it also gets white a huge fork threat and another fork threat. And how do you parry both at the same time? Because f takes c5 is also on the docket to open up the d file. Oh, I think f takes c5 and queen f2 just looks terrible for black. Everything's falling apart at the seams.
I think that was a brilliant try from Hikaru. A pawn sacrifice. He didn't even take back on d6, which he could have. He hops his knight into d5. It was a clearance move. And now knight f6 checks a big threat. If d5, as you said, rook f1 or queen to f2 actually looks even stronger. Hitting c5, going to f6, hitting f7. Oof. Everything is under attack.
And apparently, Robert, I'm going to rewind for just a second. The only move in this position was knight to h5 to keep in contact with the e5 pawn. This is such an engine move, just dropping the knight back toward the corner. Magnus played the obvious move. He's down to 30 seconds. He's backpedaling furiously and trying to keep the center patched up. I think Hikaru can play ED. I think he can play queen f2. This is like the worst kind of position to have against Nakamura with 30 seconds left on your clock.
Although b takes c4 is an option, the b file is open, and be very careful if you're Hikaru. Do not take your eyes off the b2 pawn. If black can line queen and rook up, there are checkmate threats. But the knight on d5 covers f6, so the queen can't get there. It covers b6, the queen can't get there. Bishop e6 is trying to eliminate white's best piece.
All you can eat. Hikaru just grabbing and eating, but apparently the eval bar didn't like this move. What's the defense? I don't think Magnus can find this in 14 seconds.
No, he goes knight takes e6, queen d6, knight f6 check. Gets the queen right back. Knight c7, as you're pointing out, also looks very strong. But queen h8, wow, that is so easy to miss.
And then things get crazy. You can go e5, the knight jumps into c4. If Hikaru had 15 seconds at this point, hey, this would have been a game, but he's got a minute 40. He's got an eternity on the clock to figure this out. And he starts with e5.
Okay,
oh my gosh.
Not loved by the edges. Rook b5, if queen takes d6, you swap queens and win the d5 knight. So, you got to keep your material. And speaking of material, white is only up 1 pawn. Queen takes f6.
And queen takes b5 as a desperado. He's got to move his...
Gosh.
Wait, what does Magnus do?
What a shot.
He sacks his knight.
And then rook takes e5 at the end. And then knight... No, knight's not trapped. It's rook b8. Wow. He just goes right for the pawn.
He just wants an attack. And Hikaru could even play like king a1, bishop b1. He can curl up into a ball. Instead, he eliminates the attacker.
And is rook takes a2 a possibility?
But Hikaru going for mate. He wants rook d7.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, this is over.
1 second left. Magnus loses on time. Hikaru Nakamura sticks a knife on f6, and it is knockout.